Welcome to another Catholic Family News special report, and we are happy at Catholic Family News to welcome back Matthew Hoffman, who recently reported on his work translating the book Sacred Betrayals, which was about the testimony, the direct eyewitness testimony of the corruption in the current Vatican, the Vatican of Pope Francis. So we're happy to welcome you back and to share some more of your insight with our viewers.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great, and there's a real connection between these two programs, because the last topic we talked about the corruption in the church, the financial and moral corruption. We also know Archbishop Vigano has talked significantly about the sexual scandals in the church, in the hierarchy, and has said the real root cause of those is a plague, really, of homosexuality. He talks about a homosexual mafia that's in charge in the church. And there's a very important book and an important saint that is close to 1,000 years old, very ancient in the church, and that really has a lot of relevance for our time. So we're talking about the Book of Gomorrah, which was written by St. Peter Damian and was translated and brought republished for our times, thanks to the efforts of our guest, Mr. Hoffman. So maybe could you begin for our viewers? Some of our viewers may have never really heard of St. Peter Damian before. Tell us a little bit about his life, the times he lived in.
Well, that period of church history is one of the worst of all. The church has really, I think, passed through two periods of corruption that were particularly acute. I mean, we've had many times, there's always corruption in the church, obviously. And our Lord told us that there would be weeds among the wheat. It has always been that way. We read about some of the scandalous goings on in the church, even in the New Testament. So we know that there was scandal and there was immorality in the church. But really, there are two periods, I think, that were the worst before the period we're living in now. And one of them was the 11th century. Actually, I should say it's not just the 11th century. It's really the period from about 890 AD to more or less 1049, 1050. That was a period of horrific corruption in the church. I thought that for this interview, I could actually read a quote from Saint Bruno of Segni. He was the reforming bishop of the Italian city of Segni. And he wrote this statement about the state of the church, really pointing to the earlier part of the century he's in. He's writing this in the latter part of the 11th century. But in describing the situation of the church around the time Peter Damian was born, and then eventually began his crusade against the corruption in the church. Bruno says, the whole world had fallen into malignity. Sanctity had disappeared, justice had perished, and truth had been buried. Evil reigned, avarice dominated. Simon Magus possessed the churches. Priests did not blush to take wives, entering into abominable marriages and giving legitimacy to those with whom, according to the law, they must not even live together in a single house. But worst of all, he says, hardly any cleric could be found who was not a simoniac, I guess you would say, someone who obviously is accepting money for his position, right? Or it was paying, I should say, paying money to receive his position as a priest, to receive his sacrament, or who had not been ordained by a simoniac. Such was the church, and such were the bishops and priests, such were some of the Roman pontiffs, he says, who had the obligation to enlighten everyone else. All salt had gone flat, and there was nothing left, there was nothing with which it could be restored. And if the Lord had not sent us a seed, had not left us a seed, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's an appropriate introduction to this topic, because St. Peter Damian was in part that seed that was planted during that time by God for a restoration in the church with this terrible, terrible corruption. And he wrote a book, which eventually was, we wrote many books, many reforming books, which was the most famous one probably is the one that I translated, and that's the Book of Gomorrah. And so that was how bad the situation in the church was. There was simony everywhere. The personal corruption of the priests was just legendary. The priests would just go out gambling and having fun in public and behaving in ways that were just outrageous, living with women that they weren't even married to. In some cases, they were married, but it was illicit. In other cases, they weren't even married. And there was now a crisis, especially around the time in which Damian writes the Book of Gomorrah, around 1050 of sodomy in the clergy, a terrible crisis of sodomy as well. And so, and this was not unknown to the people. The people in some cities were literally rioting in protest against the corruption of the clergy and refusing to have anything to do with the local bishop. The bishops would become very corrupt, and then if some emperor resisted the reforming efforts of bishops in this century, of the popes in this century, those other bishops would then accept an anti-pope appointed by the emperor. That's how it was chaos, corruption everywhere. And so this actually sounds horrible, and it was, but it can be encouraging to us in a certain way to know this has happened before and we have gotten through it. And of course, the second period after that that I'm thinking of is the Renaissance popes, from about the middle of the 15th century to, we could say, to the late 16th century with Pope Pius V, who carried out a really great reform and inaugurated a new era in the church. Terrible personal corruption of the popes, scandal after scandal that produced the Protestant Reformation. That's the environment in which Peter Damian was operating when he sort of lifted up the sword, as it were, against all this corruption as a monk, a very, very ascetic, devoted, humble monk, a truly humble man, no self-righteousness in him at all, but absolute firmness, unwavering firmness and courage in his willingness to fight against the corruption in the church, to denounce it publicly, and even to denounce the popes themselves when they did wrong.
So if we can summarize first, the period is interesting as a comparison to ours, because there seem to be two strands of corruption. Financial corruption, because simony is the buying and selling of church goods or offices. So it's really a form of financial corruption. And then moral or sexual corruption. Now, I do want to ask, when you say that we have sort of both forms, multiple forms of corruption. We have a more natural, if sinful, corruption with priests and women as concubines or wives. But then also you said a rise of sodomy. So was this a phenomenon just within the clergy, or was there a sort of wider societal acceptance or engagement with sodomy, or was it really limited to the clergy?
I don't think that Damian gives much indication in his writings of there being a problem with this, a perceived problem with it at the secular level, we could say, of the laity. He does mention homosexual behavior as a terrible sin, and I think he did deal with, actually he dealt with a case, I think, among the nobility of lesbianism. But it was really more of a problem within the clergy, and particularly, I think, the monasteries. There were so many in the clergy who were monks or hermits, and he perceived this as a very common problem, and he knew it well because he was constantly being invited from his hermitage. Now, Peter Damian himself was a very worldly man, we could say, and a great orator of his time, a Latin orator, but eventually he became a monk, renounced the world, a sort of eremitic monk living in a community of hermits that would meet periodically, but they were living in their little hermitages. But he was so well known for his sanctity and learning that he was constantly invited to the monasteries in the region, constantly traveling from one to another to give talks and to consult. And so he knew what was going on, and he knew that this was a very serious problem at the time.
And so he wasn't part of an order of monks. He was just living as sort of a loose collection of hermits. Is that correct?
Well, it was something that became an order later.
Okay.
And eventually that order was abolished because there was sort of a decline in the order. But at the time, I think they were operating under the Benedictine rule, and very inspired by Saint Romuald. I don't know if you've ever heard of Saint Romuald. Just amazing man who was a sort of wandering eremitic monk, but you might think that's not a good thing, like a Vagus priest, but actually he wandered so much because he never found a permanent place and was constantly moving from one place to another in a reformed spirit himself. And so Damian was actually very much inspired by Saint Romuald and wrote his life, wrote an account of his life. Yeah. So these monks were, to a great extent, these eremitic monks, we could say, were inspired by that life, but living under the rule of Benedict.
Right. So he writes this book, the Book of Gomorrah. Was it his idea to write it, or was he asked to write it by someone?
I believe that he actually was asked to write it after he had mentioned the problems of Pope St. Leo IX. Leo IX comes into the papacy after a long line of popes going back to the later part of the 9th century. So we're talking about over 150 years of popes that, well, not all of them were bad popes, but many of them were morally compromised in various ways. They were appointed or essentially selected by corrupt civil powers, people who represented the civil power, the secular power, and many of them actually were personally corrupt and very scandalously so. But at around 1049, Pope Leo IX, who's now Pope Saint Leo IX, one of the very few popes who were canonized in the second millennium. There are many popes canonized in the first millennium, very few in the second. He's one of them. And so he comes into office, and Damian begins to interact with him very quickly as a reformer. They're both determined to reform the church. And so I believe this was requested of him when Damian let him know that he considered this to be a problem. And Leo responds very positively, despite what you will read in the Old Catholic Encyclopedia and many other sources. I don't know if you saw, if you paid much attention to that part, but that's in my translator's preface, is that there's been a sort of a thesis that's been pushed for the last 100 years, claiming that Pope St. Leo IX in some way rejected Damian's proposals to deal with this problem of sodomy, sort of poo-pooed the problem and ignored it. It's the exact opposite. It's ridiculous. There's only one scholar in the U.S. who's a real scholar, I mean, a professor at a university who specializes in this, who reviewed it. He's actually the latest word on this. I'm forgetting his name, but it's in the book. He actually says there's just no basis for this story. And so even though it's gone on for decades, a century really, it's really false. And actually in Europe, European scholars have never talked about this idea that there was a rejection of Damian by Leo. It's just a myth that was created among scholars and particularly perpetuated by, you could say, homosexualists who are but people like John Boswell, whose book is just really ridiculous. His work on homosexuality and Christianity is nuts. And very poorly researched and has all sorts of fallacies. But he pushed this claim as well, picked it up and pushed it. So yes, actually Leo asked for it and praises Damian to the skies, predicts his canonization, says that your example, you preach not only by your word, but by your example. And so it's very well received by Pope Leo, who in fact actually presided over a council that very year in which very strong penalties were instituted for the sin of sodomy. It was made into an excommunication, which was not in the law at the time. And yet we're told by some of these scholars that Leo didn't do anything. It's a bald-faced lie. He did. And of course, he also ordered reforms in Italy itself. His response to Damian contains his reform measures in response to this crisis of sodomy. And in fact, and this is another myth that my book is a kind of a myth buster on this, he actually ordered that the penalty be stronger than what Damian was recommending. We're told that he lightened the penalties recommended by Damian. It's the exact opposite. If you look closely, he actually makes this penalty stronger, or let's put it this way, he applies it to more cases. In Damian's case, Damian says, well, if it's with if it's highly frequent, I think it's something like that, or then and if it's the worst kind of sodomy, because there are grades of sodomy in it, then the person should be removed permanently. Otherwise, perhaps be given a long period of penance. But then, if they do the penance and they're sincere, then they're allowed back into the priesthood. And Leo actually said, well, even if it's not with a large number of people, if it's actually, yeah, that's what he added. He said if it's over a long period of time, not just with a large number of people. And so he actually makes it more
strict. Wow,
yeah.
That's interesting. No, I took a course, a medieval history course from Boswell when I was many years ago in college.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, definitely his approach was, this was all normal for all of history and was very accepted, and Christianity accepted it. It was, there's kind of a strand of medieval history scholarship that they've kind of really infiltrated and want to rewrite. So that's interesting. So he writes the book. The first part of the book kind of talks about, essentially Catholic teaching and perennial teaching that the sin of sodomy is a grave sin, and he traces that history. Now, it's interesting, in our time, those who want to kind of soften or change, to be blunt, the church's teaching, try to act like oh, sodomy, it's just like any other sin, really. I mean, again, there's those who want to say it's not a sin, but the kind of softer, more conservative, they want to say, oh, it's just like any sexual sin, and we shouldn't really consider it different. What's Peter Damian say about that? Is there something, you particularly unique about this sin relative to other sexual sins?
Absolutely. Well, he quite simply says it's the worst.
Yes.
That's what he says.
Yes.
The worst. He says that people who do this are demonically possessed. That, in fact, in a certain way, it's so degrading and so awful that he almost has, I would say, in a way, he has, if you look at his other letters, he wrote many, many letters that actually were little books, they're opuscula, right? They're little works, little books. On a lot of Reformed topics, and he's actually more severe. He's more severe in his condemnation, in a certain sense, of the priests that were engaged in these illicit marriages or concubinage. Right? They had a concubine, but that was not because the sin wasn't worse. He says clearly, this is the worst. It's much more unnatural than than something like fornication, right, or adultery. But he almost has a little bit, in a certain sense, he thinks that these people have a mental problem, and he talks about this. He says you don't seem to understand that there's not this compatibility, or what's the word I'm looking for? This complementarity between you and another man. He's speaking to the sodomite. He says, don't you see that look at your own body, and you will see that there's just a redundancy, and the other person is participating with you in this. Yes. And what's wrong with you? Don't you see that this is insane? And then he also speaks of them being demonically possessed. So in a certain sense, there's almost a kind of a pity. Also, he is concerned that no one lose hope, even if they have to leave the priesthood. And he's very firm on this. He says, if you've gone beyond a certain point, you should never come back into the priesthood. You should lose your grade of order. But that doesn't mean you can't come back, that you cannot become a holy person, and even holier than you were if you really repent. And he says that the key to this is what he calls the barb of penance. Grab hold of that barb, which what for him, penance is very physical. It means lashing yourself, which he did. He would go on missions that the Pope sent him on. It's something that people don't know about Damian. Damian was made a cardinal, and also the popes of his time, not Leo, but it was later popes that did this. They said, he's number 2 after me. He's the second in command, and anything he says, I say. So he would send him off to faraway lands and just say, whatever comes out of this man's mouth, you can consider it coming out of my mouth.
Wow.
And so Peter on these journeys would insist that every few hours he stopped, get off of his horse. This is when he's traveling through all this snow and it's cold. He's going through the Alps, and he gets off his horse and he insists on flagellating himself for several minutes. He just constantly kept up this discipline of penance. I'm not saying that's something for everybody to do necessarily, but it was something that they did in the Hermitage. They did lots of physical penances to constantly keep their body under discipline and to avoid the temptations of the flesh. And so he's saying to people, take that barb in your hand and let it lift you up and liberate you from this through penance, through repentance and penance. You can get out of this. So I want to say he's not cruel at all. He shows a lot of compassion. He says, my soul grieves for you. I weep for you, the fallen soul. The fallen city of your soul is like the fallen Babylon, right? We read about in the scripture. So it's a beautiful book, and it's not a cruel book, but it's very firm. And he discusses just how destructive it really is to the soul, that the soul is just destroyed and tormented and can never have peace. And yes, that's it. So he certainly thinks that this is, of all the grades of sin, it's the worst. He actually says it's worse than bestiality in his opinion, because he says at least bestiality only kills one soul. But he says with sodomy, 2 souls are destroyed. And he's always talking about the death of the soul, right? That the soul dies and remains in death if there's no repentance. And then after that is the everlasting flames of hell, which he doesn't hesitate to talk about. All of this is out of charity. This is not, it's telling the truth to people so they can be liberated from the hell that already they've begun to live, and that they will be living forever if they don't repent. That's real charity. That's real love. He's a deeply loving man, truly.
So, and again, obviously very different from the supposed compassion now, which instead of compassion in the sense you express that, this is something horrible that you're doing and has consequences. I want to help you. Just sort of excuse, oh, well, you can't help yourself type of compassion, well, false compassion. So it's really good to hear. And again, if you get the book, you can read this in St. Peter Damian's own translated words. So he denounces the sin. He talks about what's wrong with it. He talks about its effects, as you say, the destruction of the soul. Then what is his plan for reforming the church? Can you maybe walk us through how he proposes the church deal with this?
Well, one of the things he really understands is that the example of the clergy the clergy have to set the example. If they're not living the faith, if they're creating this terrible scandal continuously, then reform can't occur. So he's constantly encouraging the popes to remove these bishops who are doing evil. He also speaks openly about the corruption of the popes themselves, as did St. Bruno. They didn't hesitate to do this. They understood that popes could be corrupt, and sometimes we have to speak out, obviously respectfully. One thing I say that I like to emphasize in discussions of the book is that Damian always he was like a we could say Luther's good twin. Luther is his evil twin, because unlike Luther, whose solution to this problem was to essentially abolish the institution of the church, to simply say the church is a spiritual institution, there's no hierarchy, there's no clergy. Damian actually says that he understands that the papacy is key to the reform of the church, that if the papacy isn't reformed, then there's not going to be any reform of the church in general. He understands the church must have a hierarchy that is hierarchical by its divine constitution, that this can't be done away with. And he doesn't let himself be eaten up by resentment either. He's constantly denouncing, but also encouraging repentance, and always has the hope. He never loses hope. I think Martin Luther was a person who, apart from being tempted by power, simply lost hope. He did not have the virtue of hope. And St. Peter Damian has it in spades. And this is something that bothers me sometimes about some traditionalists. I see people having this sort of fatalistic view in which we can never go back, and all we can do is be hiding in our homes or in caves or something and doing what we do. And it's not true. I mean, if God wants to bring about the end of the world before he brings about a reform, I mean, we know that in the last days our Lord said that things would be bad. But unless that's his plan in this case, God can just as easily lift everybody back up, just like he lifted the pagan Roman Empire out of the sewer of its paganism and superstition and evil, and made it into something much better, at least. Always there was corruption, but gave us the glories of the church and everything that it produced for so long. So God can do this, and we should never think otherwise. And I think it was the reform of the clergy. He understood, if you don't have a clergy that leads, and it has to lead, and leading means showing courage. It means standing up to people. Can I mention an example of that?
Yes, please.
Just a great example from the biographical introduction I have to the life of Damian in the book, because I think that's a very important part of this book, is reading the whole life of Damian. This life that summarizes all of his reforms and his reform measures, his battles, his fights to reform the church. Well, the Pope at one point sent him into Germany to confront the emperor, because the emperor was trying to walk out on his wife. Things weren't going well, and he wanted an annulment, and he really didn't have grounds for an annulment. He claimed that they never consummated the marriage. Nobody believed it.
Talk about Luther. This sounds like the twin of Henry VIII in England.
Yeah, right. Sure. Yes. You can see they're often these very terrestrial motives, we could say.
Yes.
Carnal motives that push people. And by the way, these German emperors were often very much the impetus to stop the reforms in the church, because they found simony to be very useful. They also wanted to control the process of appointing bishops, and they wanted things under secular control. So when those movements were also counteracted by these emperors. Well, anyway, so this emperor had his whole clergy in line with him. They were all going to go along with it, say, yes, your marriage is annulled, and you can go in there and marry somebody else. And this was being discussed in Rome. Damian was one of I believe he was a cardinal at the time, and the Pope Damian, I think, mentions this is horrible. And the Pope says, well, we need to do something about it then. And who's willing to go? And everyone's quiet because they're terrified. I mean, this is the emperor.
Yes.
And his whole clergy is with him. And Damian says, I'll go. And he was already, I think, rather elderly at the time, wasn't afraid of anybody. In fact, they schedule a meeting because Damian is the representative of the Pope. They schedule a synod. And Damian's headed there, and the emperor is there with his bishops all lined up. And when he hears that Damian's on the way and he isn't going to back down, he's coming. The emperor literally flees from him.
Wow.
And this was an example. Everyone knew that Damian wasn't afraid of anybody. That what if somebody tried to kill Damian? What if something happened? He didn't care. Career? He had no career. The reason he was a cardinal was that literally the Pope actually threatened him with excommunication if he didn't accept the cardinalate.
Wow.
He didn't want to be a cardinal. He wanted to be in his hermitage. He wanted to write. He wanted to write in favor of reform and maybe give talks, but he did not want to be, he didn't want power. He didn't care. He didn't care about his career. Imagine the contrast with our prelates today, who even when they know the truth, right? They live in terror because they could get into some kind of trouble if they speak the full truth. Damian was eager to do it. He had no fear because he knew he had God on his side. If God's on your side, who could be against you, right? You can't lose, even if something physically. It's like the Saint Justin Martyr says to the emperor, he says, you can kill us, but you can't hurt us. This is really, I think Damian lived it that way. So anyway, it's a perfect example of Damian showing that courage that our prelates need to show. And he's such an inspiring example of it. I think that so many cases that they were willing to stare down these politicians and not hesitate to fight publicly, go all in, they would win. It's just because they're lacking in courage. They don't trust God. He trusted God.
Now, you mentioned he, in some case, he rebuked those who needed it, including some popes. So did the church consider him schismatic or worthy of punishment for, rebuking these popes?
No, there was never even a suggestion of it.
Yes.
And neither with the others that also were willing to make those criticisms. He wasn't the only one, although he was definitely the loudest, at least during his particular time.
Which again is another point, because often in our times, when people in the church, stand up and say what they have to say about some of the scandals that touch even the highest authority, people act like this is incredible. This has never happened before. No one has ever done it. And again, some people will cite Catherine of Siena as an example, but here's certainly yet another example of a saint, a canonized saint who did that.
Absolutely. Catherine of Siena is another great example.
Yes.
The popes themselves have often remarked on the possibility of a corrupt pope and wanting to handle that problem before it occurs.
Yes.
The great theologians like Bellarmine and Suarez talking about the possibility of corrupt popes. What would you do in those cases? In some cases, even saying if they come with force they must be repelled.
Yes.
I mean, that's a strong language. It's just not our. This papolatry that has developed, it developed, I understand why, because in the last 200 years, we could say because of the battle with the modern world.
Yes.
And increasingly, the local hierarchy, the local bishops could be pressured by national governments. And so there was an increasing centralization of authority in Rome.
Yes.
And understandably so. The popes were seen as the saviors of these bishops. It transcended those national boundaries, and they were independent. But we can see that, and that's true, and it's an important part of the divine constitution of the church that the popes ultimately have a direct and an immediate jurisdiction over the whole church. And that was defined at Vatican I. It's been the theology. But we don't believe that the popes are impeccable. We don't believe they're beyond criticism. And if we can criticize respectfully, not speaking in a snide way or something. I see some people speaking in a snide kind of tone, sarcasm, and not using a proper respect for the office. Maybe the person isn't very worthy of respect, but the office is, and we have to do it in the right way. We're not acting like Catholics, we're acting like Protestants otherwise. But we still should respectfully but firmly be able to say this is wrong, and we cry out against it, and we protest it, and we want reform, and to say that. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, I became a Catholic, because I knew about the corruption in the church when I was an atheist. And I met Catholics who recognized it, but at the same time were faithful. They didn't deny it, they didn't cover it up. And that inspired me. I could see that they were serious about their faith. And that was one of the things that brought me in, was that they didn't deny what was wrong in the church.
Yes, no, it's very true. I mean, it's almost, if this can survive all this corruption, there must be something true here, in a sense.
Exactly.
So he said to reform the clergy. We've talked about that. You touched on a little bit. I don't know if you want to expand. He wanted to reform the law of the church from a disciplinary perspective. He recommended some punishments. Is some a little more you want to elaborate upon the I guess the rod of chastisement that he thought was needed as well?
Sure. Well, and what he's doing is he's drawing on the canonical tradition of the church already, because Damian was a traditionalist. You know, that really any true saint has to be. We cannot. It's like even Pope Benedict said, it was rather a liberal man, but he said the church is a historical subject. We don't remake it. So we've got to understand what the church teaches. We've got to go back to its past. So much of the Book of Gomorrah is a review of these historic canons, the laws that were created at various synods,
right,
that addressed the sin of sodomy. Also, he was very aware that the law of the church said that priests needed to be a celibate. That actually, once you get to the subdiaconate, you have permanent celibacy. There's no longer any interaction with a wife. If there is a wife, then they need to live apart. And so that was part of his crusade too, is citing those canons, citing all that tradition. So he's going back to those laws. Now, what did those laws say? Well, they were rather tough, because they were often formulated in the first, well, we could say the first millennium, particularly the first 600-700 years, in which the church had what were called the Canonical Penances. These were specific penances that were given to people by law, which later were sort of abandoned in favor of a more informal kind of system of the priest giving a penance in private confession. In the earlier stages of the church, if someone committed a particularly grievous sin, they would have to do public penance. In some cases, depending on how severe it was, like patricide, you killed your own father, killed your own mother, something like that, or you committed an act of sodomy or something like that, you might be locked out of the church for years. You have to stay in front of the church, the entrance of the church, and beg the forgiveness of everyone going in, and for years. And eventually, then you're allowed in, and then eventually, after a long period of time, you can receive communion again. He wanted a strong penitential requirement for priests that and monks that confessed and to have committed these sins. And he wanted those canons to be enforced, although he didn't want them to be necessarily as severe, because as he points out, in many cases, these ancient canons implied that if even one act of sodomy was enough, that they would be removed permanently from the priesthood, and that they would have a long penance. Damian was willing to say, okay, if it happened just a few times, and the person confesses to it, obviously after, it would still need years of penance, but then they could eventually be readmitted to the clergy. Whereas in the more severe cases, they should not be admitted, although they should have hope and not lose hope in living a life of sanctity that they could return to. So that's what he wanted. He wanted the laws to be enforced, that were on the books, or at least or some reform to be implemented to make it clear what the law is. What should be done in these cases? What kind of penances should people be given, and should they be degraded, taken out of their grade of order?
So a couple of his sections touch on, in the details there, things that are familiar to our time. So I think it's chapter 4, he talks about those who are seeking, we would say in seminaries, but the kind of modern seminary system didn't exist exactly then, but who are moving towards holy orders. So what does he say if someone has been found guilty of having this vice? Should they be ordained a priest? What's his answer to that question?
Clearly not. No, you have to review candidates, and you have to make sure that these are men of virtue, yes, and that they don't have a grave sin in their past. And actually, the Code of Canon Law still includes that kind of requirement. At least I know in the case of apostasy, because I guess you could say from the faith, or denial of the heresy. A person who's notoriously publicly heretical in his beliefs, left the faith at some point, he cannot become a priest in the future unless there is a dispensation that is reserved to the Pope, for example. That's in the current code. So yeah, the idea was you needed people, not that people, I mean, everybody sins. Augustine was a famous sinner and yet became a bishop. But if the sin is bad enough, it's just not appropriate to make people like that into priests. Just isn't appropriate. We see cases in which there was one man in Canada who actually died of cancer a few years ago, persecuted those who were trying to report on his very bad behavior as a priest, in which he was really promoting the gay agenda. Well, he had been a homosexual prostitute, and this was public. Well, how did he ever become ordained?
Yes.
It was known that he had been one. So this is just violations of church teaching, and yes, so he doesn't want that. Another legal point that he makes is that earlier councils around, I think the 9th century, for example, there's one from the 9th century. I point out in the book where he's taking these principles from, because I found the canons. My book goes into a lot of research to give you where these canons came from, these reciting. Sometimes he's actually reciting church fathers that didn't say what he claims they said, but it's simply because his reference work is wrong, and it was actually another church father. My book shows which church father actually said what he's claiming to say, because I wanted to be able to defend him against attackers who might say, oh no, that father, Basil never said that. No, Basil didn't, but it was another saint. And in fact, I showed that in the book. But so one of these canons is about priests that are caught in some fondling or kissing a child. And which is, of course, an issue that is obviously very important today. What's the church's tradition on that? Well, he says, even just in a kiss of a child, I guess he means a kiss on the lips, but if a priest is clergyman or somebody like that, a monk is caught in that kind of act, he says that they are to be, their head is to be shorn, they're to be spit upon, they're to be locked in a cell for months where they're only able to eat barley, which, is something you would feed to an animal, and doing penance day and night, and imprisoned for the rest of their lives in a monastery under the care of the constant watchful care of other monks. I mean, it's over for them once they do that, according to him. And in fact, in many of these cases, these were penitents confessing to a priest, and then the priest actually makes a move on them sexually. Sexual abuse was going on at the time, and then absolving them each one, absolving the priests, absolving each other in certain cases if they're both priests. They absolve each other as accomplices. Nobody knows. And Damian cries out against this. Of course, later in the Code of Canon Law, it became very clear that could not happen. It's in the current code. It's in the 17 code, I think. I'm sure it's in the 17 code.
Yes.
It was in the previous canons that existed before there was a code. But really, yet again, we know,
and again, we know that happened in the Cardinal McCarrick affair, even from that report, that he was doing exactly that, absolving, propositioning people and then agreeing they would each absolve each other after the act. So again, in a certain sense, I know what you say. It's consoling to say that these things happened 1,000 years ago. And again, it's obviously not consoling because they're bad things, but there's nothing new under the sun in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that we're in the worst period of the church's history right now under the Francis papacy. I'm sorry to say that.
Yes, no,
and not just under his papacies, but yes, I mean, it's really a matter of degree. There have been scandalously bad popes morally, and even in some cases they've undermined doctrine, although not so clearly, I think, as Francis, unfortunately. I mean, because it's hard for him to escape the charge of actual material heresy. I'm not saying to call him a formal heretic. To do that, you would need a tribunal that has competence, and there's no tribunal to do that.
But material, yes.
But materially, I don't know how you escape that. And actually, in these other cases, it's more marginal. So that's a really bad situation when the Pope is actually using, the acts of the Apostolic See to publish encyclicals, documents in which he's stating things that it seemed to me anyway to be actual formal heresies. Not that he's a formal heretic, but the text itself is a formal heresy, meaning that it actually contains almost the exact words you would need to state a heresy in certain cases. Right. So terrible situation. But yes, the scandals in the church, the personal immorality has been terrible in the past, and it helps to encourage us and to see we've overcome them. We've overcome this. That God has overcome this before.
Yeah. And that is, you're absolutely right, an important difference, because I take it these popes and bishops and priests who were corrupt, they weren't going around preaching that, sodomy was okay, that it was a form of love, that the church's teaching should change. So they at least had the sense, even though they were engaging this, that they weren't trying to publicly change the teaching of the church.
Well, there were cases in which they were. The popes didn't seem to embrace it, but
Right.
But for example, I will give an example. There was a lot of writing defending priests marrying and taking wives. There was a really a long debate over that in the church that went on for several centuries. But the early tradition of the church is clear on it. It is a matter of canon law, though. That isn't a matter of dogma.
I mean, that's not speaking against natural law to argue about that point. Whereas, but were they trying to justify sodomy as in the same way, or?
No, I don't. No. I don't think that anybody went on a campaign to do that today. It's just open.
Yes,
it's amazing. Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this project, how you came to translate the book, and then in addition, as you say, provide a lot of other helpful surrounding information to help understand the book. How did the project come about?
It came about during my time as a reporter here in Mexico. I was principally reporting for LifeSite, also for some other publications, Catholic World Report. But I was often covering the scandals in the church. In fact, at LifeSite, I was one of the people who maybe earliest insisted on getting onto the issue of the sort of legitimation and the legalization and the promotion of homosexual behavior in our society, because I saw it as really devastating. I couldn't see how that couldn't do terrible damage. And of course, I mean, at LifeSite, there was generally an agreement on doing it, but I kind of took up that cause and really was confronting a lot of things in my research that were horrifying, and I then encountered St. Peter Damian's name and the Book of Gomorrah, and I realized that I really needed to learn about this. I needed to read the book, and fortunately, by this time, I could read Latin because I'd made a decision around the age of 39. That was about 2009. That if I was really going to help in this process of reforming the church, which I think we all should try to contribute in whatever way we can, that I was going to need to learn Latin. That we really just can't reconnect to the church's tradition adequately if we can't read Latin. And I know not everybody can do it, not everybody has the time. I fortunately really was able to just work, because it's very inexpensive to live in Mexico. I could work part-time and actually spend the rest of my time just learning Latin and other languages, which is how I learned them. And so with that, I was able to actually sit down and start reading his material. And then I found that the material that you can find online, the actual Latin text, because it has been translated into English, but both translations are difficult to obtain, and they're not actually accurate. Neither one of them is accurate fully. And so I realized that there needed to be an accurate translation from the critical edition, which was difficult to obtain. And I obtained that. And at first I was going to be an article for LifeSite. It was essentially just going to be, here's the text, one of our writers has translated it. And I realized, no, this needs to be a book, and people really need to know Damian, not just know the text of his book, but they need to know about him and his campaign against ecclesiastical corruption. And that's why the name of the book is The Book of Gomorrah and St. Peter Damian's Struggle Against Ecclesiastical Corruption. And it's a fuller account of all that. And I realized that this would be important. And it actually, there's been a lot of response. The book continuously sells without publicity. People are constantly talking about it by word of mouth, and it's never stopped selling since it hit the market in 2015.
Well, so it continues to sell.
Definitely,
yes,
yeah. It always does, and it surges. It surges when there are scandals. For example, the McCarrick scandal, there was a massive surge in sales. Actually, I will tell you this: when the book first came out, someone living in Casa Santa Marta ordered the book. Someone living there ordered it. I can tell you, I don't know who. Oh, actually, well, I guess I do have an email address, but I won't say who it was. Actually, I don't know who it was exactly. I have an email address, but I would not reveal it. Right. But there was someone in Casa Santa Marta who ordered it. I actually sent it to the Pope, and he sent me a standards thank you letter. I have no idea if he read it or not. But a lot of priests ordered the book initially, and I'm sure that other priests have been reading it since. But it was a high percentage of those who read who wanted this book. It was priests. It was clearly father this and father that. When the orders were being put through to Itiad Tome of Books and Media, which is the publishing house that was created by Francisco Romero Carrasquillo, a professor of philosophy and theology at a seminary specializing in Thomism. He created this publishing house to publish the book. We really both created it together. And so we had a lot of priests that responded at that time.
Excellent. Yes, and Ite Toma Press published it. It is available still, both in a paperback and a Kindle form. Here you see the cover of the book as well, and I've touched on briefly. We've gone through it, but here you see briefly the table of contents. As we've said, you get a foreword by Cardinal Juan Sandoval Iniguez. Iniguez. Sorry, my Spanish is not perfect pronunciation. And then we get an introduction, as we said, into St. Peter Damian's crusade against ecclesiastical corruption. And the letter of endorsement by Pope St. Leo IX. So again, touching on that, now they try to act like Leo IX didn't like this, but we have an actual letter of endorsement. And then you see again some of the various chapters of the book, giving his analysis of the situation. So and again, not a very long book. I've read through it. You can read through it fairly quickly. It's all told, even through the abbreviations and everything, only over 160 some pages. So again, really a great relevant resource for our time. So, thank you for making this resource available to the public.
Thanks for having me on.
And again, thank you for joining our show. Again, I think an important complement to our prior show on the corruption we talked about, and in that show in the current Vatican, and lots of similarities between the time of St. Peter Damian and our own. If you have enjoyed listening to this program, I've learned a tremendous amount from Mr. Hoffman. I'm sure you have. Please share this video to your contacts. Please subscribe to our channels on Rumble. And we are still, although we do have our one strike so far, we're still on YouTube at the moment, and your audio podcast channel. And please, if you enjoy our free content, consider subscribing to Catholic Family News, e-edition or print edition, because we do go into many of these topics in much more detail. Over the years, we've run several stories about this book. We've had a couple authors who have written a little bit about it over the years, but obviously reading the book itself and talking to someone so familiar as Mr. Hoffman is particularly unique. But we've also had Randy Engels published many times on the scourge of sodomy in the hierarchy in the priesthood today. Done a lot of research on that. So you can obviously find much more of these topics. Some of those articles I refer to are in our electronic archive, which you have full access to with a current subscription as well. So thank you again, and hopefully we can have you back another time to discuss some more relevant topics, and we appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
All right. God bless everyone.